Hello everyone, and welcome to 7th grade Math Module 4, Percent and Proportional Relationships. In this video, we're looking at lesson 4.1, percent. Our learning goal is to make sure we can convert between decimals, fractions, and percents, including decimal percentages and percentages greater than 100. This will help us to master Standard 7 RPA 1. Compute unit rates associated with ratios of fractions, including ratios of length, areas, and other quantities measured in like or different units. In order to calculate percents, we need to first remember what percents are. So percents are a number that represents a fraction or decimal amount as a number out of 100. And if we take the word percent and we break it down to its roots, we have per and cent, which just translates directly into for each 100. And that makes sense. Our little symbol for a percent kind of looks like you take the number 100, grab the 1 off of it, and slant it sideways in between the 2 zeros of 100. To try to visualize some percents, we have some hundreds grids here, and we can use them to represent these fractions and then see what they look like as percents. So 30 over 100 would be 30 colored in blocks out of these 100. That is 30% of our whole, 30 per 100. For 3 out of 100, or 3%, we only have 3 of the boxes out of the full 100. And then for 1/3 out of 100, we only color in 1/3 of one box, and that is 1/3 of 100. So each of these are different percents that are decreasing by a power of 10 each time. So they're decreasing by one place value each time. Now, we've already covered how to convert between fractions and decimals. So remember, for going from a fraction to a decimal, you divide the numerator by the denominator. And to go from a decimal to a fraction, you write the value of your decimal in the numerator without any decimal point. And then in the denominator, you put the power of 10 of your lowest place value. Today, in order to convert from decimals to percents, all we need to do is take our decimal and multiply it by 100, which just ends up effectively taking our decimal point and moving it 2 places to the right. In order to change our percents to decimals, we will do the inverse of dividing by 100. And when we do that, we're essentially just moving our point for our decimal 2 places to the left. So when you're going from decimal to percent, your digit that's in the tenths place should be in the ones place at the end, and then the reverse is true for percent to decimal. The digit that's in your ones place should now be in the hundredths place. When we're working with fractions, because percents are per 100, we want to try to take a percent and write it as a fraction by taking the numbers and putting it over 100. Now, if we have a percent that doesn't have a decimal point, this is really easy. You just take the digits from your percent and put them over 100 and then simplify if needed. If you have a percent that has a decimal point in it, it may be easier to convert from your percent to a decimal first and then to write that decimal as a percent. Otherwise, you will have a complex fraction that may have a decimal in the numerator. To go from fractions to percents, you can simply turn your fraction into a decimal by dividing, and then follow our steps of multiplying by 100 to turn your decimal into a percent. For some fractions, you may find it easier to write an equivalent fraction that has a denominator of 100, and then simply write your numerator as your percent. However, this will not work for all fractions. So now that we've reviewed the steps for converting between fractions, decimals, and percents, let's try it with a fraction, a decimal, and a percent. So I'm going to start with 350%. First, I'm going to try to turn it into a decimal. I know that to go from a percent to a decimal, I need to divide by 100, which just moves my decimal point 2 places to the left. So when I convert this, I end up with the decimal 3.5. To write my fraction, I can either use my percent or my decimal to write my fraction. If I use my percent, I can take the 350 and put it over 100 for my fraction. Oops, got rid of my 3 there. If instead I start with my decimal, it's very easy for me to see that I would end up with a mixed number with a whole number of 3, and then 5/10 I know is 1/2 as a fraction. So you could do it from either one, but no matter what you choose, when you simplify, you do end up with 3 and 1/2. You can pause the video here and try to convert our decimal of 25 thousandths and our fraction of 1/8 into their corresponding fraction, decimal, and percent amounts. How did it go? In order to convert the decimal 25 hundredths into a percent, all I need to do is multiply by 100, which leaves me with 2.5%. When I go to change this amount into a fraction, I have 2 options. I could either start with the percent or start with the decimal. For this problem, since there is still a decimal in our percent, I find it easier to start with the decimal. But if I did use the percent, it would be 2.5 over 100. I then would have to convert that into an equivalent fraction that didn't have a decimal in the numerator. So to just avoid all of that, if I took instead the decimal, and I took the 25 from it and put it over the lowest place value of 1,000 for the thousandths place, I then will get my fraction of 25 over 1,000, which simplifies to 1 over 40 when I divide the numerator and denominator by 25. Last, for 1/8, going from a fraction to a decimal is a simple step of doing 1 divided by 8, which leaves me with the decimal of 125 thousandths. To go to my percent, I could try to find an equal fraction with 1/8 that has a denominator of 100, but with my decimal, it's a lot simpler to just multiply by 100 to get my percent of 12.5. What does this video make you wonder about converting between fractions, decimals, and percents? Write your questions down so you don't forget them. Then you can try to find answers online or ask a classmate or teacher. Thanks for watching, and when you're trying this on your own, remember, if you learned from your failures, then you succeeded.